The thunderous crack of lightning split the sky as Willa Porter stepped down from the stagecoach, her gaze fixed on the dilapidated ranch that stretched before her. Dust swirled around her ankles as she clutched her satchel tighter, the deed to her late uncle's property feeling heavier than the storm clouds gathering overhead. This forgotten corner of Colorado territory, just outside the growing settlement of Riverbank, would be her last chance at a new beginning if she could survive the man who now glowered at her from the porch of the weathered main house. "You're 3 days late," came the gruff voice of Preston McAllister, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dimming light of dusk. His hand rested casually on his gun belt as he assessed her with cold blue eyes. Willa straightened her spine, refusing to be intimidated by the infamous rancher her uncle's lawyer had warned her about. "Mr. McAllister, I presume? The stagecoach broke an axle outside Denver. I came as soon as I could." He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Don't much matter now. Half the cattle scattered during the storm last week. What's left of the barn won't make it through another." His eyes narrowed. "Your uncle made a foolish decision leaving half this land to a city woman." "Half the land to me, half to you with the condition we work it together for 3 years before either can sell," Willa said, reciting the terms that had brought her from Philadelphia to this desolate stretch of land. "I'm well aware of the arrangement." Preston descended the steps, and Willa fought the urge to step back. At 32, he was a legend in these parts, a former Army scout turned rancher who'd survived 3 Indian attacks and a bullet to the shoulder during the war. The scar that traced his jawline only added to his fearsome reputation. 3 years, he laughed without humor. "You won't last 3 weeks. This ain't Philadelphia, Miss Porter. This land breaks men twice your size." Thunder rumbled overhead as Willa felt the first drops of rain. "Then I suppose I'll have to prove you wrong, Mr. McAllister. Now, if you'd be so kind as to show me to my quarters before we're both soaked through." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, but it vanished quickly. "Suit yourself. Your uncle's room is upstairs." "I sleep in the bunkhouse with the hands." He gestured to a smaller structure nearby. "We start at dawn, every day." As he turned to walk away, Willa called after him, "Mr. McAllister." He paused without turning. "I may not know much about ranching, but I know about rebuilding. That barn will be standing before winter comes." This time he did turn, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. "Brave words, Miss Porter. We'll see if they're worth anything when your hands are bleeding and your back's breaking under the Colorado sun." Willa watched him stride away, his words settling like stones in her stomach. She'd come too far to turn back now. Her teaching position in Philadelphia had ended in scandal when she defended a student against a school board member's son. With her reputation in tatters and her savings dwindling, her uncle's timely death had provided an unexpected opportunity, even if it came with the complication of Preston McAllister. As she climbed the creaking stairs to the main house, Willa made a silent promise to herself. She would rebuild this ranch, and somehow, she would find a way to work beside the hardened rancher who clearly wished she'd never arrived. Dawn broke with merciless brightness, and Willa forced her aching body from the lumpy mattress. She'd spent half the night clearing dust and cobwebs from her uncle's abandoned room, and the other half wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But as she splashed cold water on her face from the basin, she reminded herself that she had nowhere else to go. She dressed quickly in the practical work clothes she'd purchased in Denver, sturdy trousers, and a loose shirt that had earned her scandalized looks from the shopkeeper, but would serve her better than corsets and petticoats. Pinning her chestnut hair into a tight bun, Willa headed downstairs to face her first day. The kitchen was already bustling. A middle-aged Mexican woman stirred a pot of something that smelled heavenly, while two weather-beaten cowboys slurped coffee at the rough-hewn table. "Miss Porter," one of them said, standing awkwardly, "didn't expect you'd be up so early." "Mr. McAllister mentioned dawn," Willa replied, accepting a cup of coffee from the cook. "Thank you, Mrs. Elena Vasquez," the woman said with a warm smile that transformed her careworn face. "Cook and housekeeper. These two troublemakers are Jake Miller and Tom Rollins." The men nodded respectfully, clearly uncertain what to make of her attire or her presence. "Where is Mr. McAllister?" Willa asked, sipping the strong coffee gratefully. "Been up since before first light," Jake said. "Checking the south pasture, said to put you to work in the garden until he gets back." Willa bristled at being assigned without consultation, but nodded. "The garden it is, then." Elena touched her arm. "It needs much work. No one has tended it since your uncle fell ill. Preston, Mr. McAllister, he knows cattle and horses, not vegetables." The garden proved to be less of a garden and more of a battlefield where weeds had claimed decisive victory. Willa attacked it with determination, relishing the simple physical labor after the long journey. By midday, her back ached and her hands were filthy, but she'd cleared nearly half the plot. Not running back to Philadelphia yet. Willa straightened at the sound of Preston's voice. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion, watching her with an expression that seemed almost disappointed she hadn't failed already. "The day is young, Mr. McAllister," she replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "And there's much to be done." He dismounted in one fluid motion. "Come with me. Need to show you the property lines before you start making changes I don't approve of." For the next 2 hours, he led her on horseback across the vast property. Willa, astride a gentle mare Elena had helped her saddle, listened carefully as Preston pointed out creek beds, grazing lands, and property markers. His knowledge was impressive, his delivery brusque. "That ridge marks the northern boundary," he explained, pointing to a distant line of hills. "Beyond that is Blackwell territory. Old man Blackwell's been trying to buy this land for years." "Why?" Water rights. Preston's gaze swept over the landscape. "Your uncle and I dammed the creek last spring. Gives us water through the dry season. Blackwell wants it." Willa studied the lay of the land. "Is that why you stayed? To protect the water?" Something hardened in Preston's expression. "I stayed because your uncle saved my life during the war. I owed him. And now that he's gone, now I'm stuck with you for 3 years." He turned his horse. "That barn needs to be torn down before it falls and kills someone. That's your first real job." As they rode back, Willa observed the collapsed section of the barn roof, mentally calculating the work needed. Her father had been a carpenter in Philadelphia before drink took him. She'd learned more at his side than most women ever would. "I'll need supplies," she said. "And help," Preston snorted. "Supplies cost money, Miss Porter, and my men are busy with the herd." "Then I'll find a way," Willa replied, a plan already forming. "This is my land too, Mr. McAllister. I intend to make it profitable again." That evening, after a simple but hearty meal prepared by Elena, Willa spread paper on the kitchen table and began sketching plans for the barn. She worked by lamplight, aware of Preston watching her from the doorway. "You know something about building?" he finally asked. "My father was a carpenter. I helped him until I was 17. She didn't add that his death had forced her to become a teacher to support herself. Preston studied her drawings. "We don't have half these materials." "We will," Willa said confidently. "I noticed Riverbank has a sawmill and I brought some money with me." "Not enough." She met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll find more. There must be something I can do in town to earn extra." "A woman working for wages," Preston shook his head. "This isn't the city, Miss Porter." "No, it's not," she agreed. "In the city I'd have more options. Here, I'll have to be creative." A ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. I look forward to seeing that creativity in action. Good night, Miss Porter. Over the next week, Willa settled into the punishing rhythm of ranch life. She rose before dawn to help Alina with breakfast, spent mornings in the garden or helping with lighter ranch chores, and afternoons planning the barn reconstruction. At night, she would fall into bed exhausted, only to rise and do it all again. Preston remained distant but watchful. Occasionally, she would catch him observing her work, his expression unreadable. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations brief and focused on ranch business. On Saturday, Willa rode into Riverbank with a basket of fresh vegetables from the revived garden. The small town consisted of one main street with the essential businesses general store, blacksmith, saloon, and a small church. She headed straight for the general store. Miss Porter greeted the shopkeeper, Samuel Wilson. "What brings you to town today?" "Business, Mr. Wilson." Willa placed her basket on the counter. "I've brought the first harvest from the McAllister Porter Ranch garden. I thought perhaps we could arrange a trade vegetables for building supplies." Wilson examined the produce appreciatively. "Fine vegetables, indeed, but I'm afraid they won't cover the cost of what you're needing for that barn." "What if I added my services?" Willa proposed. "I notice you have no sign outside your store. My father taught me to carve." "I could make you a proper sign in exchange for credit toward supplies." Wilson's eyes lit up. "A sign, you say? Been wanting one for years." By the time she left the store, Willa had secured enough credit for initial supplies and promised to return with the sign within 2 weeks. Her next stop was the Riverbank Herald, where she convinced the editor, a harried man named Frederick Campbell, to let her write a weekly column on household improvements in exchange for advertisement space for the ranch's future products. When she returned to the ranch that afternoon, Preston was waiting on the porch, his expression thunderous. "Wilson sent word about your arrangement," he said without preamble. "What do you think you're doing?" Willa dismounted, tired but satisfied with her day's work. "Securing supplies for our barn, Mr. McAllister. Isn't that what you wanted?" By carving signs and writing for the newspaper, he stood, looming over her. "You're making a spectacle of yourself. People will talk. People always talk, Mr. McAllister." "I'd rather give them something worthwhile to discuss." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "The supplies arrive Tuesday. I hope I can count on your men to help unload them." For a moment, they stood locked in silent confrontation. Then, unexpectedly, Preston's expression shifted. "You're nothing like your uncle described." "How did he describe me?" "A proper Philadelphia lady who taught children and played piano at church socials." Willa smiled faintly. "I am that woman, Mr. McAllister, but I'm also my father's daughter." Something changed in his eyes, then a flicker of respect, perhaps. "Tuesday," he said finally. "I'll have the men help." Tuesday brought not only the promised supplies but also 3 local men looking for work. Word had spread about the barn raising at the McAllister Porter Ranch, and with the harvest season still weeks away, they were eager for paid labor. Preston found Willa directing the unloading of lumber. "What's this?" he demanded, gesturing to the men. "Extra hands," she replied calmly. "I'm paying them from my savings. Without consulting me. Time is of the essence if we want the barn ready before winter," Willa pointed out. "Besides, you said your men were too busy with the herd." Preston's jaw tightened, but he offered no further objection. Instead, he surprised her by rolling up his sleeves and joining the work. His strength was impressive as he hoisted beams and directed the placement of support posts. The old barn had to be dismantled first, a dangerous job given its precarious condition. Preston insisted on handling the most hazardous sections himself, climbing into the rafters to cut away rotted beams while others worked below. Willa watched him with grudging admiration. Whatever his flaws, Preston McAllister was not afraid of hard work or danger. When a section of roof suddenly shifted, nearly crushing one of the hired men, Preston moved with lightning reflexes, shoving the man clear and barely escaping himself. "That was close," Willa said, handing him a canteen of water afterward. Preston drank deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Too close. This whole thing could come down at once." "Then we need to be smarter about it," Willa suggested. "What if we rig a pulley system from that oak tree? We could control the collapse better." He studied her thoughtfully. "That might work. Where'd you learn about pulley systems?" "The same place I learned about barn raising. My father." She hesitated, then added, "He built theaters in Philadelphia before the drink took him." Preston nodded, a new understanding in his eyes. "Let's try your way." The pulley system worked brilliantly, allowing them to dismantle the dangerous sections without further incident. By sunset, the old barn was completely down, and the foundation for the new structure was taking shape. As the workers departed and the ranch hands returned to their evening chores, Willa and Preston stood side by side, surveying the day's progress. "We work well together," she observed quietly. Preston said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the setting sun painted the mountains gold. "It's a start," he finally conceded. "A small one." It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered since her arrival, and Willa accepted it with a smile. "Tomorrow we begin framing. I hope you'll join us again." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I've got cattle to move to the north pasture, of course." She tried to hide her disappointment. "The ranch comes first, but I'll be back by midday," he added unexpectedly. "Those support beams will need extra hands." As Willa watched him walk away, she realized that for the first time since her arrival, Preston McAllister had actually made a promise to her, and somehow, she knew he would keep it. The barn raising continued over the next 3 weeks, with progress visible daily. True to his word, Preston divided his time between ranch work and the construction, often working alongside Willa until sunset. Their communication remained primarily task-focused, but the hostility had faded, replaced by a wary professional respect. One evening, as they worked together securing roof trusses, Willa noticed Preston favoring his right shoulder. "You're hurt," she observed, setting down her hammer. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Old war wound acts up sometimes. Let me see." When he hesitated, she added, "Mr. McAllister, I've been bandaging injuries since I was a girl. At least let me make sure it's not getting infected." Reluctantly, he sat on a nearby beam and allowed her to examine his shoulder. The scar was jagged and poorly healed, the skin around it inflamed. "This wasn't treated properly," she said, gently probing the area. "Field surgery," he explained tersely. "Confederate doctor with more whiskey than medical supplies." Willa frowned. "Wait here." She returned with a jar of salve Alina had made from herbs in the garden. "This will help with the inflammation," she explained, applying it carefully to the scarred tissue. Preston remained silent during her ministrations, but his body gradually relaxed under her touch. When she finished, he flexed his shoulder experimentally. "Better," he acknowledged. "Thank you." "You should rest it tomorrow," Willa suggested. He shook his head. "Can't. Blackwell's men have been spotted near our north boundary. Need to ride out and make sure they're not damming our creek again." "Then I'll go with you," she said impulsively. Preston stared at her. "It could be dangerous." "All the more reason you shouldn't go alone with an injured shoulder." When he began to protest, she added, "I'm not asking permission, Mr. McAllister. This is my land too." Their eyes locked in another silent battle of wills, But this time there was something different in his gaze, a reluctant admiration, perhaps even amusement. "Be ready at first light," he finally said. "And bring that salve." Dawn found them riding north across dew-dampened grassland. Preston led the way, alert and watchful, occasionally pointing out landmarks or signs of wildlife. Willa followed on her mare, absorbing every detail of the land that was now partly hers. "Your uncle used to do this ride with me," Preston said unexpectedly as they paused to rest the horses near a copse of trees. "Every Sunday, rain or shine, he loved this land. Why did he leave it to me?" Willa asked the question that had puzzled her from the beginning. "We weren't close. I only met him twice in my life." Preston dismounted, stretching his back before answering. "He followed your career, kept newspaper clippings about the school where you taught. Was mighty proud when you stood up to that school board, even though it cost you your position." Willa stared at him in surprise. "How do you know about that?" "He told me everything." Preston's voice softened with rare emotion. "Joseph was like a father to me after the war. When he fell ill, I wrote those letters for him, to his lawyer, to his friends, to you. You wrote the letter inviting me here." She dismounted to stand before him, suddenly seeing their relationship in a new light. "Wrote it, but the words were his." Preston looked away. "He wanted you to have a fresh start, thought you had the backbone to make it out here." "And you disagreed," Willa stated, remembering his cold welcome. "I thought he was being sentimental in his dying days," Preston admitted, "leaving half his life's work to a woman he barely knew." His eyes met hers. "I'm starting to think he saw something I missed." Before Willa could respond, the crack of a rifle split the air. Preston reacted instantly, pushing her to the ground and covering her body with his as another shot splintered the tree beside them. "Blackwell's men," he muttered, drawing his pistol. "Stay down." "I'm not hiding while you get yourself shot," Willa whispered fiercely, reaching for the rifle in her saddle holster. Preston looked at her in astonishment. "You know how to shoot that thing?" "My uncle taught me on his visits to Philadelphia. I'm actually quite good." She checked the chamber. "Cover me while I move to those rocks." For a moment he seemed torn between admiration and concern. Then he nodded. "On my signal." What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Preston and Willa, working with unexpected coordination, managed to pin down their attackers behind a rocky outcropping near the creek. "We need to flank them," Preston called to her between shots. "I'll draw their fire if you can work your way around to the east." Willa nodded, slipping between boulders as Preston provided covering fire. Her heart pounded as she navigated the rough terrain, rifle clutched tightly in her sweating hands. This was nothing like target practice in Philadelphia. When she reached a position overlooking the attackers, 3 men crouched behind rocks, she took careful aim and fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt inches from the nearest man's boot. "The next one won't miss," she shouted. "Drop your weapons." The men, startled by fire from an unexpected direction, hesitated. Preston seized the moment to advance, his pistol trained steadily. "You're on McAllister Porter land," he called out. "Trespassing with firearms, that's hanging offense in these parts." The standoff ended with the men surrendering their weapons and mounting their horses under Preston's watchful eye. "Tell Blackwell if I catch his men on my land again, I won't be as merciful," Preston warned as they departed. "And tell him Miss Porter is an excellent shot." When they were alone again, the adrenaline of the confrontation gave way to an awkward silence. Preston holstered his pistol, regarding Willa with new eyes. "That was impressive," he finally said. "Reckless, but impressive." "I could say the same about you," she countered, still breathing hard. "Is this a regular occurrence? More frequent lately?" Preston checked his horse for injuries before continuing. "Blackwell's desperate. Droughts hit his land harder than ours because of the creek diversion. Willa frowned, thinking, perhaps we should consider a more permanent solution than shooting at each other. What did you have in mind? Negotiation, she suggested. A formal water-sharing agreement that benefits both ranches. Preston's expression darkened. Blackwell doesn't negotiate, he takes. Everyone negotiates when the alternative is worse, Willa insisted. Let me try, at least, before someone gets killed. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Write to him if you must, but don't expect much. They completed their inspection of the property line without further incident, though Preston remained vigilant, his hand never straying far from his weapon. As they rode back to the ranch, Willa noticed him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What is it? She finally asked. Just wondering what other surprises you're hiding, Willa Porter, he replied, using her first name for the first time. The familiar address sent an unexpected warmth through her. Life is full of surprises, Preston McAllister, she answered with a small smile. Perhaps for both of us. Back at the ranch, word of their confrontation with Blackwell's men spread quickly among the hands. Willa found herself receiving respectful nods from the cowboys who had previously regarded her with skepticism. Even Alina's attitude shifted, her motherly concern now tinged with a new respect. That evening, as Willa prepared to retire for the night, a knock came at her bedroom door. She opened it to find Preston standing awkwardly in the hallway, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in his hands. Thought you might need this, he said gruffly. After today. Willa hesitated, then opened the door wider. I was about to say the same to you. They settled on the small settee near the window, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. Preston poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass, handing one to Willa. To surviving Blackwell, he proposed. To partnerships, Willa countered, touching her glass to his. The whiskey burned pleasantly as Willa sipped it, watching Preston over the rim of her glass. In the lamplight, his features seemed softer somehow, the perpetual hardness in his eyes temporarily banked. You've changed things around here, he observed, gesturing vaguely to the room she had transformed with simple touches: a quilt on the bed, wildflowers in a jar, her books arranged on a shelf. For the better, I hope. Different, he said noncommittally, but without the disapproval that would have colored such a comment weeks ago. Joseph would be pleased, though. He always said this place needed a woman's touch. And what do you say? Willa asked boldly. Preston swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I say you're not what I expected, and that's not entirely unwelcome. Coming from him, it was practically a declaration of friendship. Willa smiled, feeling the tension of the day finally begin to ease. The barn should be finished within 2 weeks if the weather holds. Fastest barn raising I've ever seen, Preston acknowledged. The men are calling it Willa's miracle behind your back. She laughed, surprised and pleased. Hardly a miracle, just good planning and willing hands. She paused, then added more seriously, including yours. Thank you for that. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the space between them, something neither was ready to name. Preston broke the moment first, draining his glass and standing. Dawn comes early, he said, his gruff manner returning. Get some rest, Willa, you've earned it. After he left, Willa stood at the window, watching as he crossed the yard to the bunkhouse. In just a few weeks, she had gone from unwelcome intruder to partner in his eyes. It was progress, however tentative. She touched her cheek, remembering the feel of his body sheltering hers from gunfire, the unthinking protectiveness of the gesture, the solid warmth of him. Dangerous thoughts, she warned herself. Preston McAllister might be warming to her presence, but he remained a man shaped by hardship and loss. As she prepared for bed, Willa reminded herself that she had come to Colorado for a fresh start, not romance. The ranch must be her priority, making it profitable, securing her future. Yet as sleep claimed her, it was Preston's rare smile that followed her into dreams. The coming weeks brought new rhythms to the ranch. The barn neared completion, standing tall and sturdy against the backdrop of mountains. Willa's vegetable garden yielded bountifully, providing food for the ranch and additional produce to trade in town. And her weekly column in the Riverbank Herald had become unexpectedly popular, earning her a small but welcome income. Most surprisingly, Willa's letter to Nathaniel Blackwell had received a response. The neighboring rancher had agreed to meet to discuss a potential water-sharing agreement, a development that left Preston simultaneously impressed and suspicious. "He's planning something," Preston insisted as they rode toward the neutral meeting ground, a small church halfway between the two properties. "Blackwell doesn't compromise. Perhaps he simply realized that endless conflict benefits neither of us," Willa suggested. "Or maybe his wife read my column on sensible negotiation in the Herald," Preston snorted. "More likely he's curious about the woman who outflanked his men." The meeting proved surprisingly productive. Nathaniel Blackwell, a white-haired man with shrewd eyes, listened attentively as Willa proposed a scheduled water-sharing arrangement that would ensure both ranches had access to the creek's flow. "Your uncle would never have suggested such a reasonable solution," Blackwell remarked, studying the map Willa had prepared. "My uncle is no longer here," she replied evenly. "And I prefer cooperation to conflict when possible." Blackwell glanced at Preston, who had remained stoically silent throughout most of the negotiations. "And you, McAllister, you're agreeable to this arrangement. If it keeps your men off our land and away from our creek dam, yes," Preston answered flatly. By the meeting's end, they had drafted a simple agreement that would allow Blackwell access to the diverted creek water 2 days each week, enough to sustain his cattle through the dry season, without significantly impacting the McAllister Porter Ranch. As they rode home, Preston seemed lost in thought, his usual alertness temporarily inward-focused. "You're quiet," Willa observed. "Are you unhappy with the agreement?" "No," he said after a moment. "It's fair, better than I expected." "Then what troubles you?" Preston's gaze swept over the landscape before returning to her. "You've accomplished in less than 2 months what Joseph and I couldn't manage in 5 years. A new barn, peace with Blackwell, respect in town." "We accomplished those things," Willa corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of it alone." "You would have found a way," he said with unexpected certainty. "You're formidable, Willa Porter," she laughed, pleased and embarrassed by the compliment. "Formidable enough that you might start calling me Willa instead of Miss Porter all the time." A smile tugged at his lips. "I reckon I could manage that." The barn's completion called for celebration. Willa organized a barn dance, inviting neighbors, townsfolk, and even the Blackwells, a gesture of goodwill that raised eyebrows but was cautiously welcomed. Alina and Willa spent days preparing food, while the ranch hands cleared the new barn floor for dancing. On the evening of the celebration, lanterns illuminated the fresh-cut timber, and fiddle music filled the air. Willa greeted guests at the barn entrance, dressed in her best skirt and blouse, her hair arranged in loose curls rather than her usual practical bun. "Miss Porter, you've worked miracles here," Samuel Wilson said appreciatively as he entered with his wife. "McAllister's place hasn't looked this fine in years." "The McAllister Porter Ranch," Willa gently corrected, smiling. "And thank you, but it's been a joint effort." As the evening progressed, Willa found herself constantly busy ensuring food was plentiful, introducing newcomers, mediating a tense moment when Blackwell and one of Preston's hands nearly argued over an old grievance. Through it all, she was aware of Preston watching her from various corners of the barn, his expression unreadable. It was nearly midnight when he finally approached her, extending his hand as the fiddler began a waltz. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. Willa placed her hand in his, ignoring the speculative glances from those nearby. "I thought you didn't dance, Mr. McAllister." "Preston," he reminded her, leading her to the center of the floor. "And I make exceptions for formidable women who rebuild barns and negotiate peace treaties." His hand settled at her waist, warm and steady as they began to move with the music. Willa was acutely conscious of his proximity, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the careful way he guided her through the steps. "You dance well for a hardened rancher," she observed, looking up at him. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied, a rare personal detail offered voluntarily. "Said no McAllister would embarrass her at social gatherings. She sounds like a determined woman." She was. Something softened in his eyes. "You remind me of her sometimes." "That same stubborn streak." Willa raised an eyebrow. "I'm not certain if that's a compliment." "It is," he assured her, his hand tightening slightly at her waist. "Highest one I know how to give." They danced in silence for several moments, the music wrapping around them like a spell neither wished to break. When the waltz ended, Preston didn't immediately release her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "Thank you for the dance," Willa said when she finally found her voice. "Thank you for the barn," he replied simply, but his eyes said much more. The celebration continued late into the night, but something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. As guests departed and the ranch hands began clearing away the remnants of the feast, Preston found Willa standing alone outside the barn, gazing at the star-filled sky. "Successful evening," he commented, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," she agreed. "Though I think I've had enough socializing to last me until Christmas." He chuckled, the sound still rare enough to catch her attention. "Not the social butterfly your uncle described, then." "I can play the part when needed," Willa admitted, "but I prefer quieter company." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Preston took a half-step closer, his hand lifting as if to touch her face, then dropped as Jake called from the barn doorway. "Boss, Blackwell's asking about that bull you mentioned selling." Preston stepped back, the moment broken. "Duty calls," he said, his voice gruff once more. Willa nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Good night, Preston." He hesitated, then surprised her by catching her hand and pressing it briefly to his lips. "Good night, Willa." As autumn deepened into winter, the McAllister Porter Ranch settled into a productive harmony. The repaired barn housed healthy livestock. The garden's harvest had been preserved for the cold months, and the herd had fetched good prices at market. Even Blackwell had honored the water agreement, creating an uneasy but functional peace between the properties. Willa's presence had transformed not just the physical ranch, but its atmosphere. Alina smiled more, the hands took greater care with their appearance at mealtimes, and even Preston had softened, his gruff commands now occasionally tempered with please and thank you. Most noticeable was the change in how Preston and Willa worked together. The tentative respect forged during the barn raising had evolved into genuine partnership. They consulted each other on decisions, shared meals together in the evenings, and sometimes sat in comfortable silence by the fire, Preston whittling while Willa read aloud from one of her books. On a crisp December morning, Willa stood at the kitchen window, watching fat snowflakes begin to fall. She had been at the ranch for nearly 6 months now, half a year that felt simultaneously like a lifetime and the blink of an eye. "First real snow," Alina observed, placing a cup of coffee at Willa's elbow. "Preston says it will be a hard winter." "The barn is ready, the woodpile stocked, and the root cellar full," Willa replied confidently. "We're prepared." Alina's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Yes, the ranch is ready." "But are you and Preston ready for what?" Willa asked, though she suspected she knew what the housekeeper meant. "For admitting what everyone else can see," Alina replied with gentle directness. "The way you look at each other when you think no one notices." Heat crept into Willa's cheeks. "Alina, Preston and I are partners in this ranch, nothing more." "For now," the older woman said with a shrug. "But winter nights are long and cold in Colorado." Before Willa could formulate a response, the kitchen door burst open, bringing a swirl of snowflakes and Preston's imposing figure. "Storm's coming faster than I thought," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Jake and Tom are bringing the remaining cattle down from the north pasture. We need to prepare for a blizzard." The next hours were a flurry of activity as the ranch battened down for the approaching storm. Willa worked alongside the men, securing shutters, checking livestock, and ensuring emergency supplies were accessible. By nightfall, the snow was falling heavily, driven by howling winds that rattled the windows. The hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, and Alina to her small room off the kitchen, leaving Willa and Preston alone in the main house. "Fire's stoked, lamps are filled, and there's coffee ready," Willa reported, joining Preston in the parlor where he stood by the window, watching the white fury outside. "You've thought of everything as usual," he said, turning to face her. In the firelight, his features seemed softer, the perpetual vigilance in his eyes replaced by something warmer. "We've come a long way from your arrival day." Willa smiled, remembering his cold welcome. "You weren't exactly thrilled to see me step off that stagecoach." "I was an ass," Preston acknowledged bluntly, "set in my ways and resentful of change." "And now?" Willa asked, her heart suddenly beating faster. Preston took a step toward her. "Now I can't imagine this place without you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, more revealing than any flowery speech could have been. Willa's breath caught as Preston moved closer still, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Willa," he said, her name almost a question on his lips. She answered by closing the distance between them, her hand coming to rest against his chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Yes," she whispered, though he hadn't actually asked anything. Preston's hand came up to cradle her face, his calloused thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "I'm not good with words," he murmured. "Never have been." "Then don't use them," Willa suggested, her eyes holding his. The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question, an offering. Then Willa's arms slid around his neck, and Preston pulled her closer, the kiss deepening into something that spoke of months of restraint finally abandoned. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the barn dance," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" "Wasn't sure you felt the same. Wasn't sure I deserved someone like you." His honesty was disarming in its simplicity. "Preston McAllister," Willa said firmly, framing his face with her hands. "I rebuilt your barn. I negotiated with Blackwell. I shot at trespassers and planted vegetables and wrote newspaper columns. Do you really think I would have done all that if I didn't care deeply for this ranch and the man who runs it?" A slow smile spread across his face, the most unguarded expression she had yet seen from him. "When you put it that way, I sound rather dense." "Stubborn," she corrected, kissing him lightly. "But I've been told I have a stubborn streak myself, so perhaps we're well matched. Outside, the blizzard raged, but within the walls of the ranch house, Willa Porter and Preston McAllister had found a warmth that would see them through the winter and beyond. The storm lasted 3 days, burying the ranch under feet of snow and effectively cutting them off from town. For Willa and Preston, it was a blessing in disguise, a period of enforced intimacy that allowed their newly acknowledged feelings to blossom without outside distractions. They spent hours talking by the fire, Preston finally sharing the painful stories of his service in the Union Army, the bullet wound that nearly killed him, and how Joseph Porter had found him half dead and nursed him back to health. "He saved more than my life," Preston explained as they sat together on the parlor sofa, Willa's head resting against his shoulder. "He gave me purpose again, a home." "Is that why you stayed, even after he died?" Willa asked gently. Preston nodded, his fingers absently stroking her hair. "Partly that, partly because I had nowhere else to go." He paused, then added quietly, "And then you arrived and gave me a whole new reason to stay." Willa shared her own history, in turn her father's slow descent into alcoholism after her mother's death, her struggles to support herself as a teacher, and the scandal that had ultimately driven her west. "The school board member's son was bullying a younger student," she explained. "When I intervened, he claimed I had struck him. His father ensured I was dismissed without references." Preston's arm tightened around her. "The boy lied, blatantly, but his father was wealthy and influential," she sighed. "I was considering becoming a governess when Uncle Joseph's letter arrived. It seemed like Providence." "It was," Preston agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple, "for both of us." When the snow finally relented, and the ranch hands managed to clear paths between the buildings, reality intruded on their private world. There was work to be done, cattle to feed, repairs to make, supplies to inventory. Yet something fundamental had changed in how they approached these tasks. Where once they had worked side by side as cautious partners, now they moved in unconscious harmony, anticipating each other's needs, sharing touches and glances that spoke volumes. The hands exchanged knowing looks but kept their comments respectful, while Alina merely smiled with maternal satisfaction. As Christmas approached, Preston rode into town as soon as the roads were passable, returning with supplies and a mysterious package he refused to let Willa see. She, in turn, had been secretly working on a gift for him, a leather-bound ledger with the McAllister Porter brand embossed on its cover, ordered from Denver months earlier. On Christmas Eve, the ranch celebrated with a feast that brought together hands, neighbors, and even a tentatively friendly visit from the Blackwells. The main house glowed with candlelight and pine boughs, and a small tree stood in the parlor corner, decorated with paper stars Willa had cut and painted with Alina's grandchildren. After the guests departed, and the house grew quiet, Preston led Willa to the parlor where the fire burned low. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving the package he'd hidden earlier. Willa unwrapped it carefully to reveal a beautifully crafted silver hairbrush and mirror set, engraved with her initials. "Preston," she breathed, running her fingers over the fine workmanship. "It's exquisite." "Ordered it from Denver after the barn dance," he admitted. "Seemed fitting for a lady who's brought so much beauty to this rough place." Touched beyond words, Willa presented him with her gift in return. Preston examined the ledger with obvious appreciation, turning it in his hands to admire the detailed embossing. "For our future," Willa explained. "A place to record our progress together." "Our future," Preston echoed, something solemn entering his expression. He set the ledger aside and took her hands in his. "That brings me to my other gift, or perhaps it's more of a question." Willa's heart began to race as Preston sank to one knee before her, still holding her hands in his larger ones. "Willa Porter," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when you stepped off that stagecoach, I thought you were the worst thing that could happen to this ranch. I was wrong. You were exactly what this place needed, what I needed, though I was too stubborn to see it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you'd wear it as my wife." Tears blurred Willa's vision as she looked at the man kneeling before her, this hard, honorable man who had gradually revealed his heart to her. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, Preston McAllister, I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was a promise, a seal on the future they would build together. "When?" Preston asked when they finally broke apart. "Spring." Willa shook her head, smiling through her tears. "New Year's Day. I don't want to wait, and neither does the ranch. We have cattle to brand, fields to plant, and a foreman's cottage to build for Jake and his bride." Preston laughed, the sound free and joyous in a way she had never heard before. "Always thinking ahead, aren't you?" "Someone has to," she teased, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're too busy being formidable." New Year's Day dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow glittering under a brilliant blue sky. The entire community gathered at the small riverbank church to witness the union of Preston McAllister and Willa Porter. Willa wore a simple cream dress ordered from Denver, with a blue shawl that matched Preston's eyes. Alina had woven winter berries and evergreen sprigs into her hair, which fell in loose waves down her back, a compromise between the formal updo expected of a bride and the freedom that characterized their life on the ranch. Preston waited at the altar in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed and his face cleanly shaved. As Willa walked toward him on the arm of Frederick Campbell, who had agreed to stand in for her late father, the expression on Preston's face was one she would treasure forever: wonder, joy, and a fierce pride that matched what she felt in her own heart. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, a public declaration of the partnership that had grown from reluctant coexistence to deep, abiding love. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to more eyes than just Willa's. The celebration afterward at the ranch was boisterous and joyful, with dancing in the barn they had built together and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Even Nathaniel Blackwell raised a toast to the couple, acknowledging how their union had brought positive changes to the entire valley. As evening fell and the party continued, Preston drew Willa away from the crowd, leading her to the porch of the main house where they could look out over their land together. "Happy, Mrs. McAllister?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Very," she assured him, leaning into his warmth. "Though I think we should consider McAllister Porter for all official ranch business," he chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Whatever you want. I learned months ago that arguing with you is pointless." "A wise man," Willa teased, turning in his arms to face him, "and getting wiser by the day." "Only because I have an excellent teacher." Preston's expression grew serious. "I love you, Willa, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Preston McAllister." She stretched up to kiss him, her heart full to bursting. "Now and always." Over the following years, the McAllister Porter Ranch prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Preston and Willa expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and eventually purchased adjacent land when Old Man Blackwell retired to Denver. The water-sharing agreement Willa had negotiated became a model for other ranchers in the region, and her weekly column in the Herald evolved into a small but successful book of practical advice for frontier households. Their first child, A son they named Joseph after Willa's uncle, arrived the winter after their wedding. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Margaret, who inherited her mother's determined spirit and her father's startling blue eyes. 2 more children would eventually complete their family, William and Elizabeth, twins who arrived unexpectedly when Willa was 36. Through the years, through droughts and blizzards, through prosperity and hardship, Preston and Willa remained steadfast partners. The barn they had built together stood strong against Colorado winters, a visible symbol of what could be accomplished when stubbornness gave way to cooperation and suspicion to trust. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Preston presented Willa with a hand-carved plaque for the barn entrance. McAllister Porter Ranch, it read. ESD, 1872, built on trust. Willa traced the lettering with her finger, remembering the hostile man who had greeted her that first day. "We've come so far," she mused. "We have," Preston agreed, taking her hand in his. The years of ranch work had added more lines to his face and more silver to his hair, but his eyes still held the same warmth when he looked at her. And it all started with a collapsing barn and a stubborn Philadelphia woman who refused to be intimidated. Don't forget the equally stubborn rancher who eventually learned to say please and thank you, Willa reminded him with a smile. Preston laughed, pulling her close. How could I forget? He was the luckiest man in Colorado territory. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the ranch in gold, Willa rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that they had built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals, a family bound by love, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The barn, once broken and dangerous, now stood as the heart of their thriving ranch, a testament to what could be rebuilt when trust was given a chance to grow. Just as Preston McAllister, once known throughout the territory as the hardest man to work beside, had been transformed by the woman who had refused to give up on either his barn or his heart.